Hello, History 363. So today we're going to be talking about Rome and the Greek East up until the Second Macedonian War. We sort of left off with our narrative of the Second Punic War with the Battle of Zama, with the peace between Rome and Carthage, which is finally hashed out in 201. It's worth maybe taking a brief step back and sort of looking at Rome's a broader engagement, both diplomatically and militarily, with the Greek East. And of course, studying this engagement was particularly important to Polybius's intellectual project. Polybius, one of our most important sources for this whole period, an Achaean statesman held captive in Rome, nonetheless impressed by Rome's raw power and the effectiveness of its governance. And therefore, Polybius is writing his history really to explain to Greek audiences how Rome came to dominate the whole known world, but particularly the Greek East. So Polybius is really interested in Roman imperialism in the Hellenistic East. And here we actually should also be careful, because what Polybius is interested in as our most important surviving literary source tends to be what we become interested in. So therefore, huge amounts of scholarly attention have been paid to the Roman engagements in the Greek East, diplomatic, military, cultural, social. One thing we should actually remember, if we consider sort of the big problem of the Roman Republic, which I actually do, is the problem of Roman imperialism. That really, for the Romans, both before and after the Second Punic War, is going to be focused in northern Italy. Roman imperialism in the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries BC is about Cisalpine Gaul. It continues to be after the Second Punic War, where the Romans continue to deploy legions, consular assignments, just general focus. The resources of imperialism go to the north of Italy, of what today is the north of Italy, back then Cisalpine Gaul. So for the Romans, Roman imperialism in the early second century BC is about continuing to exert Roman control north of the Apennine Mountains, securing the best agricultural land on the entire Italian peninsula, broadly defined. And events in the east are somewhat sideshows, even though for Polybius they're the main event. Year after year, the Romans are sending armies, again, to Cisalpine Gaul. They only occasionally send an army or a fleet to fight in Greece or Macedonia or Anatolia. Now, the first Roman intervention into the sort of Greek East broadly defined is actually not against Greeks at all, but against the Illyrians. The Illyrians are people who live in what's today roughly Albania. And the Illyrians are actually a highly fragmented society, fragmented cultural group. But there is one group of Illyrians in the 230s that is forming into a kind of more coherent kingdom. And this kingdom is actually inherited by a queen by 229 named Tuta. And these Illyrians, again, are, Illyrians are sort of notorious as brigands and pirates. But Tuta actually seems to find herself at the helm of a state that is gelling, that is with an army and a navy, and capable of doing things that just brigands and pirates can't do. Now, that being said, Tuta is now in a position as a sort of, brigand state turning into a real state to actually significantly threaten just trade and activities in the Adriatic. And this seems to raise Roman alarms. There is some diplomacy, and indeed we hear that Italian peoples are routinely going to Rome saying, hey, there's pirates in the Adriatic, will you do something? And generally the Romans ignore this, but Tuta gets their attention, that this sort of new gelling state is worrisome to the Romans, as a potential threat to their own control over the Adriatic coast of Italy. So in 229, there is a brisk expeditionary force sent against Tuta. This is after there has been some botched diplomacy, in which it seems, among other things, a Roman envoy has somehow died on the way, and the Romans accused Tuda of murdering him. The war itself is a pretty small-scale stuff. That is, the Romans win handily. One of Tuda's own lieutenants, a guy named Demetrius of Pharos, switches sides to Rome, and the Romans install him essentially as the regent of Tuda's infant son. So basically their solution is, we're just going to let Demetrius of Pharos sort of control this Illyrian state that we were worried about. But we've got our man there and everything is fine. Certainly I think we can say that with this war, the Romans probably do start to consider Illyria and at least this part of the Adriatic coast as a kind of Roman sphere of influence, although there's probably nothing necessarily super formal about this. And we've already talked in the lead up to the Second Punic War, how in 219 the Romans launch another expedition against Illyria. And the reason is their man in Illyria, Demetrius of Pharos, hasn't proven as reliable as the Romans have hoped. In fact, he goes on a huge kind of buccaneering expedition, going down and even rampaging down deep into Greece. And this seems to alarm the Romans, saying, hey, the guy that we thought was just going to keep everything calm is now acting like is now engaging in piracy and brigandage on a truly massive, again, state-level scale. We're going to put a stop to this. And again, they think this is more serious than necessarily relieving Saguntum, which is about to fall to Hannibal. Now, once the Romans launch their expedition, both consuls, big army, big fleet, Demetrius of Pharos is pretty handily beaten. He goes into exile, actually, and becomes a friend, a philos of Philip V, becomes a courtier in the Macedonian court. And the Romans, again, sort of leave, having left, found a new regent to look over Illyria, seemingly actually a guy who had sort of been a partner with Demetrius on this buccaneering expedition. So we have these two Illyrian Wars, the so-called First Illyrian War, 229, the Second Illyrian War in 219. And those are the main Roman engagements in the Greek East so far. Both very brisk and both, again, not really interested in necessarily creating any kind of permanent province. The Romans seem to have a problem with the Illyrians. They settle the problem. They leave. Now, we mentioned when we talked about the Second Punic War how Philip V, the young king of Macedonia, had been foolish, or maybe not foolish. He'd maybe done what was the wise thing. After the Battle of Cannae, he sets a peace treaty with Hannibal. It's not a treaty of military cooperation. He doesn't declare war on Rome, but he does seem to acknowledge that southern Italy from now on is going to fall under sort of Carthage's hegemony. Now the Romans intercept a copy of this treaty and are so furious that they declare war on Macedonia by 214. Now the Romans are at war with Macedonia. Already, this is the First Macedonian War from roughly late 215, early 214 down to 205. Now, the Romans, while they have this declaration of war, don't really invest a lot of resources in it. They send some ships. Eventually, they'll send a small military force. But Macedonia is always a true sideshow compared to the theaters where the Romans really care about, say, large commitments of troops against Hannibal, and then eventually Spain, Sicily, and then finally Africa. So they're not super interested in really actually bringing the war home to Philip. In fact, the Romans don't really get the war going until 211, when they finally recruit a proxy who can fight for them. And that proxy is the Aetolian League, a federal league in central Greece that had previously fought a war with Philip from 220 to 217. This is the so-called Social War. For those of you in 362, we just talked about this. So the Aetolians fight as land proxies from 211 down to 206. And in 206, Philip starts inflicting some bad defeats on the Aetolians, and they carve out a separate peace. This may or may not trouble the Romans, but they settle. They basically sign a peace in 205, which ends the war. So the First Macedonian War is basically a desultory draw. It's over in 205 with the so-called Peace of Phoenicate. And then the Romans continue to focus on winning the Second Punic War. 205 is Scipio's consulship, 204 he's in Africa, and 202 we have the Battle of Zama. Now, here is a real puzzle. In 200, the consuls, new consuls for the year, who are inaugurated March 15th, 200, asked the Roman people to declare war on Macedonia. And the war-weary Romans, who remember have been mobilized, have been at war for for the last 18 years, who have suffered extraordinary casualties, who have seen the Roman citizen body reduced by roughly a third in terms of the census return. The Roman people say no; they vote the war down. And one question we should ask ourselves is, why did the consuls even want to go to war anyway? Now, again, when we had the lecture on, well, why did Rome go to war? The idea of the Romans as pathologically belligerent, most forcibly advocated by William Harris, is oftentimes brought up here. Well, we've beaten the Carthaginians. Time to find a new war. Oh, Philip V looks good. Let's find someone who maybe even we have a little bit of bad blood with. Now, and that could be, although remember, it's very rare that this is the only really time we have where the Roman people simply refuse and outright reject a request to declare war. This will be a vote taking place in the Comitia Centuriata. So that's one possibility. We have just pathologically bellicose consuls and the people rejected. Now, another reason why the Romans may be more leery, maybe ready actually to go to war with Macedonia, and this is sort of deals with the kind of IR theory advocated by Arthur Eckstein, is that Macedonia may look like it's much, much more powerful in 200 than it had been in 205. And the big event, the kind of earth-shattering event, is the death of Ptolemy IV of Egypt, probably around 204. His death may be kept secret for a while. And once this sort of death becomes common knowledge, and once it's realized that he's going to be succeeded by a son who's a very small child, Ptolemy V, and the Ptolemaic kingdom basically becomes a failed state. There is a botched regency, there's rioting and violence in Alexandria, and it's pretty clear that the people who are trying to run this now truly dysfunctional state don't have the ability to really organize an effective military response. So supposedly there is a secret pact, which is later revealed, at least to the Roman Senate, by the envoys from Rhodes and Pergamon. The secret pact involves Philip V and his Seleucid counterpart, Antiochus III, coming up with an agreement to divide the possessions of Egypt and to take advantage of this child king and this dysfunctional regency. This means that Macedonia, which recently was a Roman enemy, is now going to become much more powerful. And indeed, one thing Philip starts doing is he goes on the war path against various possessions in the Aegean that probably were almost all, at one point, Ptolemaic possessions. And so this involves, among other things, a campaign in Caria. The two places that he's threatening as war breaks out is A, Athens. Athens has a long-standing relationship with Ptolemy. His threats to Athens are sparked actually by an odd religious dispute. Two youths from the Arcanian youths who are from a league that is allied with Macedonia, spy on the Eleusinian mysteries, and Eleusinian mysteries are the sacred rites to Demeter that take place annually in Eleusis, just a deme to the north of Athens. They are caught and executed, and this is sort of a pretext for Philip to send a force that threatens Athens and actually supposedly overruns Attica almost to the academy kill. But Athens is also a long-standing Ptolemaic ally. So this is kind of one of the last straws that seems to push the Romans towards intervention. Another last straw is the siege of Abydos. Abydos is a city on the Hellespont, probably a Ptolemaic ally. Philip is violently besieging it. The results of the siege are actually quite dramatic in that many of the inhabitants commit suicide rather than be captured. And we do know that a Roman envoy confronts Philip at Abydos, and it's a rather unpleasant confrontation. Now, here's our one problem. The Romans finally do declare war. A second assembly is called in the Comitia Centuriata, and this time they vote to declare war on Philip. We're not quite sure exactly when this second assembly happens. There are some scholars who think it happens very shortly after the first one. There's some that think that it happens later in the year after some of these events at Athens and Abydos take place. It doesn't help that Livy seems to have a somewhat distorted version of things, and therefore not everyone trusts his more linear narrative. Polybius, who probably has a better sense of things, at this point survives in a fragmentary form. So we don't actually get the continuous story from Polybius. So this is actually one of those things, the exact blow-by-blow details on the road to war are vague and disputed. Suffice it to say, by the summer of 200, the Romans have declared war on Philip, and a Roman consular army sets forth from Brundisium into Greece. This is going to be the Second Macedonian War. The Second Macedonian War, the early stages, on one hand, see Philip able to at least sort of, shadow box the Romans into a kind of stalemate. And finally, the Romans send a new consul, Titus Quinctius Flamininus. Now, he's had an interesting career in that he has been elected consul without actually holding the praetorship. So he's gone basically from quaestor to consul, no praetorship in between. His career probably is emblematic of the kind of irregular careers that we see taking place following the carnage of the Second Punic War. That is, so many Roman aristocrats have been killed that it's actually possible to kind of get promoted early because there's not really a surplus of people running for office. In fact, we know there have to be, after Cannae, there's an emergency sort of special census to replenish the Senate because so many senators have been killed in battle. So Flamininus himself has a frustrated year of campaigning against Philip. Indeed is willing to entertain a peace settlement which would be relatively favorable to Philip, although he ultimately declines these negotiations. And finally, in 197, his army, which has been maneuvering through Thessaly, encounters Philip's army at a place called Kos Catholic, the Dog's Head. And here a battle breaks out. The Romans are formed up at the bottom of a ridge, and this is a kind of encounter battle. There's been a whole series of skirmishing, cavalry and light infantry, and again, the Romans are formed up. Philip is, however, moving with his army, and is moving probably through some fog and mist. And so he starts marching out on this ridge and realizes that he has the first part of his phalanx on the high ground of a ridge, and below him is the Roman legion lined up like bowling pins. And so Philip, without waiting for the rest of his phalanx to come up, the second half, orders the half that is formed to charge. And the irresistible charge of the Macedonian phalanx, the densely packed troops, the 20-foot-long pikes, pushes back the Romans quite successfully. So the Romans on their left are suffering a defeat. Flamininus, however, takes the troops on the right and orders them to charge up the hill and attacks the part of the phalanx that is still forming up. And actually, in addition to his legions, he has an elephant. This is the Romans started to experiment with war elephants, presumably that they've gotten from the Carthaginians. So At the Battle of Kos Catholic, we therefore have sort of two battles going on. On the left, the Romans are getting driven back by this well-organized phalanx. On the right, the Romans are carving up the phalanx that they caught sort of still in marching order, that was still trying to come up onto the ridge and get into line. The battle ends when an anonymous military tribune on the Roman right realizes what's going on the Roman left. The Romans are getting their butts kicked. And he detaches 20 maniples, probably the triarii of a legion, shifts them over to the other side of the battlefield, and they attack the rear of Philip's forces. And this ends the battle. The Macedonians suffer heavy casualties. Over 8,000 Macedonian soldiers are killed in the battle. Philip flees. And he surrenders shortly afterward in what is still a negotiated peace. Now, at that battlefield, the Romans leave the dead bodies on the ground, and they are still visible roughly six years later as a sign, I think, of probably Roman hegemony. If you walk through that part of Thessaly, which is on a kind of main thoroughfare, you would see thousands upon thousands of bleached Macedonian skeletons, reminding you a memento of Roman power. Now, the terms of the peace treaty imposed on Macedonia are at this point pretty typical. Philip has constraints placed on the size of his army, limits on the number of warships he can have. He's forbidden to have elephants, and he has to pay the Romans an indemnity. His indemnity is somewhat smaller, only 50 talents a year, perhaps suggesting that Philip is virtually broke. So this war ends in 197. In 196, Flamininus, who is really spent, there's a lot of things to settle in Greece, particularly with the shattering of kind of Macedonian hegemony over Greece. Flamininus goes to the Isthmian Games that are held in Corinth, and he gives a proclamation. And the proclamation, which he gives in Latin, it's translated through heralds, is the embodiment of the Roman settlement that he's dictated, although it's also approved by a 10-man commission, a decemviri, that's of senators that sort of aids a successful general in making his peace treaty. But Flamininus said, this is the peace that I'm going to impose on Greece. The cities of Greece are going to be free. They are going to be ungarrisoned. They are going to be free from tribute. So the Romans aren't going to leave a legion up on the old Macedonian fortress of the Acrocorinth. They are going to pull all of their troops out. And when the Greek delegates hear his proclamation of freedom for the Greeks, they go ecstatic. They had assumed that Rome would sort of become an occupying power. And when Flamininus announces, "No, I'm leaving," they are extremely happy. There's one group of people that isn't happy. Those are the Aetolians. The Aetolians have continued to be Roman allies. There were Aetolian troops fighting at Kos Catholic. They had hoped that they would get some territorial concessions, that other Greek cities would be forcibly incorporated into the Aetolian League. And when Flamininus announces freedom for all the Greek cities, this means no one's going to be forcibly incorporated into the Aetolian League. They are actually going to be free and independent, autonomous. So that being said, the Aetolians seem to be the Aetolians are unhappy with the settlement, but almost all the other Greek cities are quite happy. Now there is one other city that actually is not happy about this, and that is Sparta. Because Sparta, which at this point is run by a tyrant named Nabis, Sparta has taken Argos, and Nabis wants to incorporate Argos, under his rule as sort of part of Sparta. And when Flamininus says, "Nope, you have to let Argos go," Nabis refuses, and there actually is a brief war against Nabis, which Roman troops, joined by other Greek allies, march against Sparta. So did Roman Sparta ever go to war? Yes, they did. The Romans quite quickly forced Nabis to capitulate. It's a really anticlimactic war. And this is actually because Nabis, like the Aetolians, is someone who doesn't necessarily like the idea of freedom for the Greeks if it means Greeks that he's trying to subdue get their freedom. Nonetheless, by 194, the last, Flamininus finally fulfills his promise. The last Roman troops pull out, there are no garrisons are left behind, and therefore Greece is left empty. And this is actually, I mean, on one hand, this seems to be this is Roman imperialism, one might say it. Seemingly it's most benevolent. They're not in it for the tribute, they're not in it for the occupation. They, smash up this nasty hegemon, Philip V, and then they leave. However, there is one real problem with leaving, because it leaves a kind of power vacuum in Greece. And there is one other dangerous Hellenistic king who might be interested in filling that vacuum, and that is Antiochus III. So next time, probably our last lecture before the midterm, we'll talk about the war between Rome and Antiochus the Great. We'll see you soon.